Good morning, and thank you for tuning in to Supercharging the Virtual Workforce, Distance Learning and the Future of Work. My name is Josh Resnick. I'm CQ Roll Call's publisher as well as Chief Content Officer for our parent company, FiscalNote. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, the XR Association, for making today's event possible. Confronted with the global health crisis and social distancing mandates, reliance on telecommunications and virtual solutions has reached an unprecedented high. With businesses, communities, and governments searching for mission-critical tools, there's been a growing demand for immersive technologies such as virtual, augmented, and mixed reality, collectively known as XR. As more industries worldwide maintain virtual collaboration as part of their long-term strategy, the importance of technology's role in education and the workforce has never been more apparent. Colleges and universities have adopted XR technologies to deliver personalized, hands-on learning experiences. These technologies can be used on campus or remotely, expanding options and improving collaboration and learning in both settings. Likewise, companies across all sectors are beginning to utilize immersive technologies to enhance training and productivity and have digitized to keep their workforce connected, trained, and resilient during this current period of uncertainty. Kicking off today's event is Representative Suzan DelBene, who represents Washington's 1st District and is the co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on Virtual, Augmented, and Mixed Reality. Interviewing the Congresswoman is CQ Roll Call's tech reporter, Gopal Ratnam. Gopal, over to you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Congresswoman, and on participating in this event. I want to start off by asking you, you're a technologist, you spent your early years in your career in the tech world. What can you tell us about why is this the right time to be advocating and pushing for virtual reality, augmented reality? What can it do for us?
Well, I think there are many opportunities, and especially right now at a time where folks are more isolated due to the pandemic, we really have an opportunity to use things like technologies involving different types of reality to allow folks to be trained in ways where they may not be able to have hands-on training, to be able to interact. Obviously, in healthcare, there have been huge opportunities with telehealth. It's not only the pandemic, though. We have the opportunity for folks in the workplace, for example, to interact in a place that might be a more hazardous environment for a worker, to do a job from further away. There are many opportunities, but technology is relatively new in terms of getting out there and having people experience and use these technologies. We're going to learn even more. So I helped set up a caucus in Congress. We call it the Reality Caucus.
Right.
And the goal there is to help educate lawmakers, update them on technology, where it's going, so we can be thoughtful about the policies that need to be put in place relative to not just technology, but reality type technologies in particular.
So how is that caucus work going? How do you find members, are they receptive? I know in the past we've had some real bloopers with some members wondering how social media works. But now this is obviously a lot more advanced in terms of technology. So in your interactions with other members, how do you find them? Are they receptive and open? Do they understand the technology and the underlying factors and so on?
I think that they do understand kind of some of the basics. I think the problem that we see is that folks don't see all the different types of use cases that are out there. Maybe they've seen kind of fun gaming type scenarios and haven't seen the workplace scenarios, the trainings and educational scenarios. And so I think it's really important that we show people the breadth and then tie it back into challenges that we have to address that impact all of technology. How is people's information going to be used? How is it going to be protected? How do we make sure these are secure environments? Those are obviously issues that aren't unique to reality type scenarios, but apply there just as well as they do to other technologies and are places where we are behind from a policy standpoint.
Right. I want to ask you about those challenges too, but in terms of, you mentioned it, how, people kind of associate virtual reality, augmented reality still with the world of gaming, entertainment, but there are applications beyond those in the world of training and education. What needs to happen? Is it the advances in technology, or is it just simply, more affordable equipment? Is it connectivity? What needs to happen for that transition to happen from gaming, the world of gaming entertainment, to the world of work and training and education?
Well, I do think affordability is a key issue, and a mainstream environment. I think there are vertical types of environments that folks can use, but in terms of having something really foundational where people can plug in and use technologies generally, kind of like you do many other types of devices today, that obviously increases the scenarios and the opportunities, but clearly pricing, and then widespread availability and reduced complexity in terms of
Right.
being able to use. And I'd say all of those scenarios are probably not that much different than other types of technologies that have taken a little bit of time before they scaled and were available very broadly. And when we look at scenarios of education, et cetera, clearly pricing is going to be important. And the last thing you brought up, which is key, is connectivity. We look at kids learning from home. In my district, which is a part of my district is a global technology hub. Another
Right.
part of my district, we don't even have rural broadband or even good cell service. So the opportunities obviously are more challenged if we're not doing a good job to make sure that the foundational elements, and that might be broadband in cases, are available for folks to experience and use these types of technologies.
You mentioned just a while ago about the privacy and how people's data will be handled and used and so on. And obviously we're in the midst of this tech backlash, people waking up, lawmakers and regulators around the world, waking up to the dangers of social media that was once seen as just nothing but good. And now we are seeing some of the downsides of it. Are there downsides that you see as a technologist and a lawmaker to broad-based, widespread applications of XR and virtual reality, augmented reality, and how should we address those?
Well, I think fundamentally the use of kind of all technologies comes down to trust. And
Right.
Folks want to know that they can trust these environments. And I think that more recently, as people have learned more, for example, about how information is used, that trust has been eroded. That's why I've introduced legislation federally, because I think we need federal privacy protections. We have issues right now. The EU Court of Justice has struck down the Privacy Shield. These are also areas where we have their international implications. So we need to make sure we have basic policies in place that protect consumer rights, that protect civil liberties, civil rights, and human rights in a technology world. And so as a policymaker, I think we haven't caught up to the way our economy works in a lot of ways, the new types of technologies, and I think it's very important. I think really fundamentally, privacy is the right place to start because it really is foundational, and why I've been working so hard to try to get other lawmakers to understand the importance of that, because if we don't move on privacy, it's harder to talk about the policies we need to put in place with respect to facial recognition, or artificial intelligence, or XR and other types of technologies in terms of how people's information will be protected. So privacy is definitely a key starting point.
Right. Now, I know obviously Congress has held several hearings and it's been going on for nearly about 2.5 years. And unfortunately, there isn't a federal legislation. States have taken the lead. I think your state, Washington, has been considering a privacy legislation along the lines of what California has done. Now, in addition to that, you also mentioned other foundational technologies. What about connectivity? Is there a danger that sort of, the spread of these new technologies, virtual reality, augmented reality, in certain pockets that can afford, that has the connectivity, somehow leads to more sort of unequal distribution of these technologies and inequality that already exists in many other spheres? Is there a danger of that kind?
Well, I think we're seeing that already. We see that just right now in a pandemic where we have school children who can't, don't have access online, don't have the same opportunities available to them. And if they aren't able to go in person, then, there's some schools in my district who've been driving packets out to students so they can get information and types of homework that they can work on. That clearly is a huge disparity in opportunity already. And we know that if you don't have that connectivity or ability to learn, even basic things like being able to learn how to code, the skills that we think are really going to be fundamental going forward in terms of work skills, those disparities will grow if we aren't able to address this, the issues of connectivity, but also the issues of cost. They go together. We also know there are folks who have connectivity available to them, but they can't afford it. So it's the physical infrastructure being available. In particular, we think of our rural areas, but then in places where there may be availability, it's affordability that's critical. And so both of those have to be met if we're really going to address the inequities that we see in not only access to technology, but access to skills and opportunities.
So now, the caucus obviously has been designed to educate members and sort of bring everybody on board in terms of common understanding. But what can Congress do to address all of these things that you mentioned, the privacy issue, the connectivity issue, the cost issue, at the same time promoting these technologies into fields beyond entertainment and gaming and others? What can Congress do there?
Well, we need to catch up on the policy side. And again, privacy is an important place to start. And I think we need federal legislation because I think we have to have protections, consistent protections across the country. And if we don't have a domestic standard, it's going to be very challenging for us to have a opinion or a position internationally when we're looking at these issues in terms of creating global standards. Also, we need to not only catch up, but we need to look ahead. We need to look at where technologies are going to understand what those impacts might be. Do pilots. There are many areas where we've tried to work on pilots so we can see what opportunities are, maybe where something works and where it doesn't, and be able to use that information to inform policy. We have things happening right now to try to have pilots on smart cities and smart communities, because we know more and more of our communities are using technologies to look at energy efficiency or traffic management, but not necessarily one technology works in every scenario. So the more we can provide that information, make sure that when governments and communities are spending, they're spending wisely and with technologies that really work in the scenarios that they're targeted for. And then finally, providing that basic infrastructure, government has a role to play to make sure that, just like we did when we looked at electrification, we need to make sure that we have the technology infrastructure, the broadband infrastructure. And in some cases that may be using new types of technologies, but we have to make sure that connectivity is available throughout our country, not just in select urban areas.
You also mentioned the international aspect. I mean, you talked about European Union and the Privacy Shield, but in a broader context in the world of technology, we often hear about the race to the top, whether it's AI or other, technologies. Is there such a race in the world of virtual reality, and should the United States be catching up, or is it already on top? I mean, where do we stand vis-a-vis some of the other top countries in the world?
Well, I think from a competitive standpoint, we always want to be innovating and forward-looking and leading the way, because there are so many scenarios that are out there that are going to be critically important. We look at, for example, on the education and training scenarios where XR can be very important. That is also about addressing workforce issues. It really could bridge a lot of gaps in terms of making sure that we have opportunity for everyone. So that's not only a workforce and competitiveness issue, it's also a international issue in terms of making sure that folks in other countries who haven't had opportunity as well have the opportunity to upgrade their workforce and have a stronger economy. I think that's important as we look around the world, when we look at issues of national security and international development. But I think it's going to be, we've got to make sure that the technologies are there, that the availability is there, and then we have the opportunity to use that to really build some really compelling scenarios in training and workforce and experience, and also in some of those areas on the entertainment side that folks have looked at.
Right.
Too.
Are you a gamer? Have you tried out some of these virtual reality headset games? I hear there are some more affordable ones that just have come out.
I have tried them. I wouldn't call myself a gamer. My son is, and so, but I've had the chance to experience both gaming scenarios, but also interactive work scenarios. Teaching people, for example, how to work on a piece of machinery and being able to use that headset to walk around and look at machinery where there may be limited supply and you may not be able to have access directly. Scenarios where folks have been in a hazardous environment and being able to interact in a hazardous environment with robotics without having to physically be there. And clearly there are many opportunities as well when we look at things like telehealth, something that's expanded quite a bit during this pandemic. And I think that will stay and only continue to grow going forward, and which is another opportunity in terms of giving people access to healthcare in areas where access might be much more difficult.
Speaking of all of these areas, and you talked about a couple of the pilot ideas, so is there one area that's outside of gaming and entertainment that is kind of really ripe and has shown some lot of promise in terms of the application of virtual reality?
Well, I think the two key ones are going to be education and training. Very big up, and there's many scenarios where it's been used. I saw folks looking at how they could use it in a scenario to help educate students going into healthcare, being able to look at anatomy and have an experience that really helps solidify information and learn in a way that is much more tangible for folks and helps upgrade the quality of the experience they get. And then I do think in healthcare as well, because we've seen robotics, things that are used in healthcare, but the ability for folks to interact and not only also from a training standpoint, I think we have huge opportunities there. But I think you're going to see it be very ubiquitous as folks start to have availability and access. I think we're going to see very creative minds use that to help solve a lot of problems.
I asked your colleague on the caucus, Congressman Steil, as well this question: is there a risk that as virtual reality applications become more common, widespread in the areas of training and workforce training and education, that those people who are actually now involved in the business of actually providing this training and education, they draw upon their years of practice and learning and knowledge to transmit that to the next generation? Are those people going to be left behind because all of that knowledge is now captured in this virtual reality machine and being, propagated on a large scale to others?
I don't think that actually has to be true, because I think we have an opportunity to give people fundamentals and fundamental training, and then actually use those folks for what you need to, which is to get that extra expertise, the detail, understanding and learning. So maybe it helps them to scale even more and really make sure they're able to share in a way that maybe is a little more challenging to do today. So I actually think we need both. We need to make sure we have the broad, widespread training and tools available to help do that. But there's also the direct experience and knowledge. You can't beat that, and you can't always replicate that. And so I think that's going to continue to be critically important.
Right. So given all of the things that Congress needs to handle and the challenges that still exist, when do you think we might be in a position where we've addressed some of the fundamental issues and these technologies are then ready to take off from there? Is it, do you see that on a 2-year horizon, it's further out there? How much longer do you think?
Well, I think technology continues to move forward independent of policy, and I think it's important that we catch up and move ahead. I do think that that fundamental element of trust is going to be very important, and without making sure that we have fundamental protections to address things like privacy, to address security concerns, that will limit people's willingness to use technologies, understandably. So it is going to be incumbent on us on the policy side to make sure that we are putting the appropriate guideposts in place, that we're looking at issues of privacy, security, and consumer protections, but also that we're looking at the ability in terms of access for everyone, the ability for everyone to experience opportunity and to get rid of some of the gaps that we've seen, the disparities that we see in STEM education today. Those are things that need to be addressed by policymakers, so at the federal level, but I'd say at all levels of government. And that's when we will see broad adoption and opportunity. If we don't do that, that trust will erode, understandably. People will be concerned about what happens to information. Technologies will not be used in ways that people feel comfortable with. And then things will slow down quite a bit, understandably. So it's very important that we do our part in terms of on the policy side, and make sure that we're using innovations that can really help solve problems and provide new opportunities.
Right. Well, I have no further questions. Is there anything I should have asked you or touched upon that you wanted to highlight?
I think it's really important that people spend time educating lawmakers. We talked about this a little bit, but folks haven't all had the chance to experience even basic forms of XR, and definitely haven't seen some of the more future ideas and where things are heading. So I do think it's very important that folks get a chance to talk to lawmakers about them, talk about the challenges and opportunities. The more folks are educated and understand where we're at and where we're heading, I think the more informed we'll be in terms of getting the right types of policies passed.
Well, great. Well, you've answered all the questions, and I have no further questions for you. And thank you so much for joining this event. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thank you, Gopal and Representative DelBene. I'm now joined by Elizabeth Hyman, Chief Executive Officer of the XR Association, a trade association representing the technology manufacturers that power the virtual, augmented, and mixed reality industries. Prior to joining XRA, Liz served as Executive Vice President of Public Advocacy at the Computing Technology Industry Association, where she led the association's outreach to members of Congress, the executive branch, and other international, federal, state, and local government institutions that shape and influence public policies affecting the IT industry. Liz also brings more than 2 decades of experience in the worlds of government, policy, and technology, including positions at the U.S. Department of Justice, Executive Office of the President, and Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. And she has experience in the private sector, both in the practice of law and in business. Liz, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Josh. Great to be here.
Why don't we go ahead and dive in? 2020 has obviously been incredibly disruptive, to say the least, and social distancing has become the norm for a great portion of the world. How has that impacted work and learning, and how has it drawn heightened attention to the value of XR technology as an enterprise solution?
Yeah, well, first of all, Josh, I want to thank you and CQ Roll Call for hosting this great session with us. And we're excited to share with this audience more information about virtual, augmented, and mixed reality technologies. And I just wanted to take one moment for those in the audience that may not be that familiar with XR, which is an umbrella term for virtual, augmented, and mixed reality. I just wanted to suggest that you visit our website at xra.org, and there's a quick 2-minute video that explains what the technology is about and how it applies to different sectors. So just wanted to put that out there. But to your question directly, I think we're at a time where this technology has such great potential to address the circumstances that we're in and to help us and society at large to think, connect, design, learn and collaborate, even when we're hundreds of miles apart or trying to confront a situation of social distancing in the global pandemic. And I was thinking a little bit as I was preparing about medical students who are benefiting today from repeated simulations of surgical procedures or medical procedures. So think about an individual that's learning how to intubate a patient, or a young medical student that is learning knee surgery as a feature of their medical pursuits, and getting to practice this type of procedure over and over and over again in an immersive three-dimensional environment. It's almost like creating the muscle memory that's required for these students to become good doctors. It helps with their educational outcome. And we hope also that it helps with healthcare outcomes, that there's better healthcare that's delivered as a result. I know we're going to have a great panel coming up, and I was thinking about Renata Fruchter from Stanford and the engineering students that she works with, who are able to collaborate with teams across the globe. So if they're working on mechanical engineering or developing code, the notion that they can have this presence with others to team on something and to have that interaction, it may not be quite the same as being in person, but it really does develop amazing, amazing outcomes. And I also know that there are companies like Walmart and JetBlue and Verizon that are already using virtual reality. They're doing it in the workplace. So again, one of our panelists, Michael Casalli from Striver, can probably speak a lot more eloquently to this than I can, but we see tremendous benefit in terms of training employees on the floor layout or on customer relations and how to effectively understand and interact with customers as they raise questions and have issues. It could be helpful in crisis management. It could be helpful in diversity, equity, and inclusion training. And we're even seeing that senior management are benefiting from the use of virtual reality with their workforce in terms of identifying up and coming middle management. So I guess I wanted to start out by saying how excited we are with the state of technology as it exists today, and see that it has tremendous applications for the workforce even before the pandemic hit, but certainly as we're experiencing the challenge of trying to be in person and have presence, we think the technology can aid significantly in that regard.
That's really interesting, and it's really intriguing to think about the opportunities for XR in education and the workplace, and you can see how that can transform people's kind of livelihoods and the way they work. Is the technology really there to make all this happen? How much of what you see in terms of the potential for this is actually able to happen today versus something that you envision, potentially coming down the path in the future?
Yeah, great question. There's some really cool applications, as I already talked about, and I just wanted to share. I had the opportunity, I've tried all the different technologies that are out there, and I was thinking about an experience I had in trying the HoloLens, and the notion of seeing, doing, and learning all at once. So say you're an assembly line worker and you're trying to learn how to connect a wing to a fuselage or something along those lines. And with this augmented and mixed reality technology, you have the benefit of the guide, the written word that is helping you as you're looking over the project at hand. And you have prompts, whether they're arrows or other things that help you to actually achieve the task, connecting the wing to the fuselage. So all at once, you have this learning, seeing, and doing that's an incredibly powerful mix. But your question comes at a really interesting time for us as an organization. We just did a survey that we wanted to find out what different sectors know or think about XR technologies and how it might be able to help them to address some of the challenges in their respective fields. When we looked at healthcare, we looked at higher ed, we looked at workforce training, retail, manufacturing, and public safety. And we saw a really high level of awareness about these technologies. In fact, 75% of the respondents were aware of virtual, augmented, and mixed reality technologies, which is great. And another 68% surveyed agreed that the XR technology can or does provide value already to their industry segment, with the largest number, 67%, agreeing that it can improve education and training outcomes. But I will say, Josh, we are still in the relatively early days of development of these technologies. And I believe that as form factors become smaller, that they're loaded with more compute power, as we see adjacent technologies like 5G and other broadband pieces unfurl, cloud and edge computing become more sophisticated, I expect that the applications and the impact of these technologies are going to become even more profound.
That makes sense. So it's there now, but obviously room for growth. What are, other than kind of, the areas that you just named, so for example, 5G, broadband, edge networks, et cetera, which is, I think, pivotal technology that's coming with regard to a number of applications. But outside of developments like that, are there other roadblocks to realizing the potential of XR? And if so, how do you see the private sector in particular attempting to address those roadblocks?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, Congresswoman DelBene in her remarks just before this mentioned the idea of cost. And we're starting to see a drop in cost. There was a new product, the Oculus Quest, is coming out at about $300. You'll see a Vive, HTC Vive at about $500. But again, as the technology becomes more sophisticated, I expect that the prices will fall, but that's about affordability. I think we're also hoping that with the release of this survey and the level of interest from different economic sectors or different industry sectors of our economy, that we'll see greater demand for different software applications. So we want to see more games. That's a lot more fun, that people want to use the technology, but we also need more applications in industry sectors to make this more applicable. And that's something we saw in our survey. But certainly, the broadband piece is important, as Congresswoman DelBene mentioned. But I also think it's about not just access, but it's also accessibility. We are looking at making sure that the design and the software that's associated with these technologies are inclusive, and they allow the broadest number of people to use the technology, enjoy the technology, and benefit from some of the workplace aspects of this. And not to have this as a conversation down the road, but that we're doing it right now. And I would point out that as an industry trade association, we take that very seriously. We have what we call our developers guide on our website at xra.org, which is a set of best practices to the developer and platform communities, so that we're encouraging good practices right from the start in terms of user experience, safety, comfort. And later this year, we're going to be releasing a new chapter on accessibility. And that's very important, so that people of all abilities can enjoy and benefit from this technology. And, we know we need to also address very complex public policy issues. The Congresswoman mentioned, privacy is something that all of technology is looking at. There are other issues that we're certainly going to have to engage in. And what our goal is to have those conversations now, that we're getting ahead of where the technology is, that we're educating people about how it works, that we're coming up with collaborative ways to think about these frameworks to ensure that there is trust in our technology as the innovation proceeds.
That's great, Liz. And you mentioned one thing there at the tail end in terms of bringing up privacy. Related to one more thing I want to ask you about, we do have time for one last question, which is, what role is there for the government to play? So are there policies in place today that either help or hurt the adoption of XR technology in the workplace, or are there policies that the government should be developing that could help adoption and create or preserve jobs?
Yeah, great question. I have a few observations on this point. I'll try to make it quick because I know we're coming to the end. But first of all, we want to work with governments in the US and abroad to do basic education. That's job number one right now. As the Congresswoman mentioned, the creation of the Reality Caucus is vital so that we can bring people along as we have these conversations. But oftentimes a great way for government to lead when it comes to emerging technologies is actually to adopt the technology. And we've seen some really interesting uses already of XR at places like NASA and FEMA and elsewhere. And we have some programs as well about building up some existing programs, say at the Department of Energy or HHS, to reskill workers into green technologies or to increase the number of nurses, and using our technology as an effective way of doing that training and education. But I think we would all benefit from a more targeted approach. And we see legislation out there, for example, the Endless Frontier Act or the RISE Act, which are looking at emerging technologies and research and development. We would like to see XR be a part of that conversation. It's been more focused, and understandably, on things like AI and quantum computing and 5G, but we think that our technologies are part of that conversation, and that R&D is an important piece of this. And I'll just close by saying that that study I mentioned, which you can find on our website at xra.org, we actually asked a question about the role of government, and over 90% of these industry leaders felt that there was a role for federal government, and 49% of them said one way to do that is to help in the funding of research and development. So, so those are some of the things, and obviously we look forward to working with Congress, with a returning or new administration, to bring sort of clarity and coordination around XR as a vital technology in our economy.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Liz. This has been really fascinating. And thank you to XRA for sponsoring today's event.
Thank you.
I'll be back in just a moment to introduce our industry panel. Great. Well, I'm really excited to have a conversation with our panel today. And before we begin, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Michael Casalli, Chief Science Officer at Striver. Compelled by all things brain and behavior, Dr. Casalli has focused his career on the science of the mind, from PhD work in the cognitive neurosciences to more applied research in healthcare and marketing. His applied quantitative background can turn insight into action. Dr. Casalli applies his years of behavioral expertise to a variety of domains, including optimizing work and home environments for motivation and learning, understanding the behavior of consumer adoption, or bridging the gap between people and technology. We also have Dr. Renata Fruchter, Director of the Project-Based Learning Laboratory at Stanford University. Dr. Fruchter is the founding director of the Project-Based Learning Laboratory, lecturer in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, and senior research engineer thrust leader of collaboration technologies at the Center for Integrated Facilities Engineering at Stanford. She leads a research effort to develop collaboration technologies for multidisciplinary, geographically distributed teamwork and e-learning. Her interests focus on R&D and larger scale deployment of collaboration technologies that include web-based team building, synchronous and asynchronous knowledge capture, sharing and reuse, project memory, corporate memory, mobile solutions for global teamwork, and e-learning. We also have Jeremy Nelson, Director of the XR Initiative at University of Michigan. Jeremy leads the effort to seed new projects and experiments that integrate XR into residential and online curricula at the University of Michigan, and to create innovative public-private partnerships to develop new XR-related educational technology. Prior to joining the Center for Academic Innovation, Jeremy was the co-founder and managing partner for Afia Inc., an Ann Arbor-based healthcare consulting firm that worked with organizations across the country to assist in selecting and implementing technology solutions to improve processes and patient experiences. And last but not least, we have Dan O'Brien, Global Head of Enterprise Solutions at HTC Vive. Dan has over 20 years of business management experience in the tech industry, holding multiple P&L roles, including 4 years in virtual reality and augmented reality technology. He is focused on delivering revenue growth, market building, strategic business development, team building, and operational management. He has a great breadth and depth of experience in virtual reality products, mobile devices, and a strong understanding of sector economics, multi-million-dollar, multi-level development life cycles, and integrated product and application implementation. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm excited for this conversation, so let's go ahead and dive in. Let's start with the big picture, even outside of education and the workforce. What are some of the most interesting potential applications of XR technology in your mind, and what impact can it have on society overall? Dan, why don't we start with you?
Thanks, Josh. Thanks for having me on today. And it's great to see all the other members of the panel and really enjoy this. So from an industry standpoint, we have seen some really compelling areas where design and visualization across education and collaboration. Things that stand out to me are things like Bell Helicopter. It was a company that normally takes 6 to 7 years to prototype a new helicopter, and they were able to do that in 6 months with prototyping in virtual environments and putting pilots into chairs and building a helicopter around them, saving them all the time and materials and costs of cutting materials, testing things before they ever really spent significant portions of their R&D budgets. So we see really tremendous effort there. We also see now where collaboration is a huge component of that, where designers and simulators can actually do these experiences together on a platform level, from pilot training to designers of car engines and engineers and artists, and even in the educational space. So we're really seeing great strides there around collaboration and cost savings to a P&L to major corporations.
Great. I think that's an excellent example. Does anyone else have any thoughts in terms of just big picture? What is the potential for this technology overall?
Yeah, just to extend Dan's thought, I mean, not to get too esoteric, I think the idea of a shared experience can be really powerful. And that can happen obviously through technologies like VR and AR. We're dealing with a lot of workforce training, very practical based types of experiences. But one of our co-founders, Jeremy Bailenson, who runs a lab at Stanford, he's done a lot of work in looking at the power of these shared experiences for communication purposes. So a lot of times, we sometimes struggle for words in order to communicate powerful messages. He does work around ocean acidification, for example, right? So writing a compelling article is not nearly as effective sometimes as actually being there and seeing the effects of ocean acidification for yourself. And you can start to do that with these shared experiences. And even on a more practical level, things like financial planning and savings, right? So you can actually project yourself, fast forward 40 years into the future. And these things aren't often conveyed well, when we're talking about just doing this as manual instruction, text-based instruction, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of power in those shared experiences, obviously for, the work Jeremy's doing, but even well beyond that.
You raised a good point with that too on the ocean acidification, and Dan, you hit on this a bit in your example with prototyping and building a helicopter and eliminating waste, right? There are ancillary benefits that we can see from the advancement of this technology as well in terms of environmental benefits and otherwise. So how important is this, not just to the future of education work in itself, but also these ancillary benefits as well? Jeremy, do you want to address that?
Yeah, no, I think from the perspective of higher education, I think there's extreme opportunity to train the next generation of students on how to experience technologies or use cases that they wouldn't. So we're working on building a virtual nuclear reactor for nuclear engineering students, and they'll be able to understand how the reactor core works. They can go down into the core in ways that they couldn't do in real life, right? You wouldn't go into a reactor core, you would die. So the way that these technologies can bring students into an experience and an understanding of these concepts in a new way is very exciting to us, and what we're able to do. Lots of opportunities with technologies like Michael had mentioned for law students or business students or nursing and public policy to practice scenarios that they may not get a chance to do or may only get a chance to do one time in a classroom. And so they can really help them understand better what's possible and what they can do.
You know, if I could jump onto that.
Yeah, to you.
God, sorry, Renata. I'm just going to add on really quick to Jeremy's note. I mean, from an ancillary standpoint, we see a safety area around firefighter training, you know, where we no longer have to put firefighters in the actual, you know, very costly simulated burning building, and having the health effects. You can actually take first responders and put them into what I would call, you know, just, you know, very fast action environments, you know, where they're safely training now instead of actually, you know, putting them into that simulated environment, which could be very dangerous for them long-term wise, you know, lung, you know, health-wise, you know, putting them in a fire, you know, in a building full of fire and smoke. So there's a lot of ancillary health and you know, carbon footprint, you know, impacts that can really drive home the benefits of this. But Renata, sorry, I think I jumped on your time there, but please go.
I believe that this immersive experience that allows students from different disciplines to break down the silos that systemic education systems have put them in creates a tremendous opportunity. Really building an appreciation of the constraints and objectives of another discipline, bridging cultures as we bring together students, faculty, and industry mentors together from all over the world, creating whole new opportunities, as we heard Suzan DelBene and Liz mention as well. And most importantly, be able to model, simulate, and experience in person together the future built environment before we break ground, and save time and resources and money. In addition, from an education perspective, it is very exciting to see how attention, engagement, and participation has moved the dial to 100% focus, because all the outside distractions are completely blocked and everyone is immersed in problem solving and understanding different issues. As we look at this XR, VR opportunity from a workplace setting, it allows us to pilot and experiment hybrid future workplaces that potentially will impact the environment, reduce energy consumption and CO2 emission, your footprint, whether you are an education institution or a corporate, with this opportunity to take distance out of distance learning and remote work, and bring back in that learning and work environment social connectedness that is so hard to experience, for instance, in a Zoom session where we still look at each other as talking heads.
No, that's a great point. And you know, one question for you in particular, since you know, you've been looking at remote work and distributed learning environments for a long time. We're talking right now about so much potential and reality around some of the examples we've heard, whether it's firefighters, whether it's Liz's example around training hospital personnel and so on. Is this part of just a trend that you've been seeing? Is what's happening now because of the nature of all the disruption from COVID? Is this an aberration? Is it a permanent leap forward? How do you see this continuing, and how do you see us proceeding towards a place where a lot of these really interesting applications become more and more available at scale?
Definitely not an aberration, and whether this is going to lead to a permanent leap forward is, in my mind, an effect that we all are actually immersed in now. It's an opportunity for us to reimagine work and learning and fun. And whether it will be evolutionary or a leap forward depends on the domain. So in my mind, for businesses that already create and use 3D content, XR will be an absolute natural leap forward. For instance, in the domain I come from, the vertical of what we call the AEC industry, or architecture, engineering, construction, or automotive industry, that is an exciting time, because as designers and builders, we think in 3D and then we build in 3D. On the other hand, we communicate in 2D. And now the third dimension is given back to us. So we, as a multidisciplinary team, whether co-located or distributed, can immerse into the future products we design and troubleshoot early and often. And on the other hand, compared to businesses that have to wait for applications and content to be created, for them, it will be more an evolutionary aspect. For instance, in my mind, travel will become a big opportunity, especially to go to far away, distant, hard to reach places, or for disabled people who cannot travel, or elderly. So availability of these immersive experiences will create whole new opportunities. And
right.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to interrupt. I was going to ask, actually, if I think that's all exactly right. And Jeremy, Michael, do you have any added thoughts on that? Jeremy, I saw you nodding your head during a fair amount of that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't think it's an aberration. I mean, this was already well along its way. I think if anything, COVID has accelerated, compressed the timeline and the need and demonstration of what's possible in this space. I think, Renata, you started to touch on it. The content creation is key, and the ability to generate more content. That was one of the things I noticed when I first started here at Michigan, is we had a lot of faculty exploring and doing research in this space, and we had a lab. But for us to go buy a bunch of devices didn't make any sense, because we didn't have enough content to justify, a 10-minute experience for one class. It didn't make sense. So we began to build out capacity and content creation across, developers and non-developers to really make the case and show examples of what's possible.
And Jeremy, you raised another good point, which is, is it really ready now, right? So you raised the problem about not having enough content. Previously, that's something you had to build out.
Mm-hmm.
So again, is this something, and this is something Liz and I spoke about before as well, but is this something that businesses and educational institutions can actually harness today?
Yeah, I mean, like the what Liz was talking about with the guides, with the Microsoft HoloLens, they already have a platform that allow you to build that. Striver and other platforms have authoring platforms where you can use more traditional video production capability to develop. You don't have to be a 3D artist and a game developer to make an impact and create content, which I think is very powerful.
And on the other hand, these new platforms really allow almost, in my mind, everyone to create content. In our case, because it's a design experience, the student teams create the content, and that content evolves, and that engages them. There is this sense of ownership. And we've seen that with other technologies and platforms as well. people don't want just to consume content. They want to create content, they want to immerse into the content, and they want to share their experiences together within the content. And that's what XR really offers.
And Michael, you work a lot with the private sector. So, when you think about businesses' ability to adopt this technology now, is that there for them to use? And is there a type of business that XR technology really is right for?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, we've obviously gone through all the trials and tribulations of trying to do this for the first time with large organizations, like Walmart's and Verizon's. There is a lot of, I think, good reason to believe that organizations are going to be able to take this on, as some of the other panelists were stating, and adopt this themselves from the content creation standpoint. And so we're finding that there's a lot of organizations that have these learning development teams that are pretty well defined, and them adopting the technology has been pretty seamless. The implementation of the technology is actually where we're finding a lot of those points of friction over the past 3 or 4 years, and that's taken a lot of work. So to do this at scale, I think has been a challenge for us, but we've obviously done a lot of work to try to overcome that, building new technologies on top of what we already have in the headsets, to make sure that we're getting kind of things out there in a way that can be accessed by everybody who needs to access them in the organization. So taking it out of the lab and going to 10,000 stores in Walmart, has been a challenge that we've been able to figure out how to overcome. But obviously these are going to, these challenges as the technology grows are going to continue to be there. So I think it's something to keep an eye on. But I do really appreciate the sentiment in terms of the content creation. We're finding, obviously, our own folks, we feel are really talented in creating content, but we're also learning from everybody else that's out there using this technology. So I think generally, from the content creation standpoint, we're finding a lot of really interesting new use cases all the time that, not only that we're generating, but that our customers are coming back to us and saying, what about this? Can we do this with the technology? And so that's been kind of a cool collaborative process with us.
And do you see those conversations, increasing in velocity now in light of everything that's going on this year? And what do you think that is going to mean, for adoption, as we look ahead, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think there's, as some of the other panelists noted, there's a lot. This is something that's an evolution that I think is not going the other way. It's here to stay. And I think that is going to become an impetus for a lot of organizations who are maybe on the fence thinking about this, to want to invest and drive adoption. There's a lot of new use cases. I think we mentioned onboarding and in our previous conversations, that could be a really just, for ubiquitous across the board, something that every organization can benefit from. Putting headsets in the home to be able to onboard people more effectively is definitely a use case. But we've been preaching this, train anywhere mantra now for a while. One of the problems in organizations is that they really appreciate the idea of training, but then you look at the compatible investment and it's not there. And that's not necessarily reflective of them not believing in the lack of training effectiveness. It's that they just don't have opportunities. Getting people in a central location, flying people around the country, we can now just distribute headsets even to the home, and people can start to access training that way. So that, I think, itself opens up a whole new kind of opportunity for organizations. Hey, my folks are home anyway. It makes sense to invest in headsets so that we can get, the type of training, and that's going to open up other opportunities. All the training that hasn't been going on before that, used to take days sometimes, now can be done in potentially minutes. And I think that's going to be really compelling. And it already is for some of the organizations that we work with.
Absolutely.
Renata, did you have something to add? Go ahead.
I would like to add that just to quote Churchill, who said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." COVID actually allows and invites everyone to step back and reimagine education and new ways of working. So in my mind, it's great to hear that Striver is sending out headsets to people at home. That's fantastic. On the other hand, whether it's academic or corporate, it should be, in my mind, strategic. And now, due to COVID, since we are all in the same situation worldwide, it probably is much easier to deploy new ways of working, trying out, exploring, understanding new work practices, and then bringing them as part of new workflows and processes. So think about the business fit to the different XR offerings and look at both the tactical and the strategic aspects. So it's not just about the acquisition of the technology, it's that strategic approach towards new ways of working and processes. I like to remind everyone, it's people, people, people. The technology acquisition is the easy part of the equation. The people is the hard element that needs tremendous support.
That's a great point. And I'm sorry, go ahead, Dan.
Well, I was just going to say, and what we see quite often right now is enterprise and professional use cases are really the fastest growing market segment of XR right now. While we see consumer continuing to grow and grow and grow, when we look at the rate of adoption and speed of adoption, we see enterprise and B2B kind of the space really adopting at a much quicker rate. And I think, as Jeremy and Renata and Michael have all kind of noted, like the COVID situation has actually accelerated a lot of corporate interest in understanding what other technologies exist and how can they improve, training, how can they improve collaboration, as Renata, really hit on really well with, the people and still being able to be connected and have those interpersonal interactions. It's so critical. But we're also finding, some other areas where, things like stroke rehabilitation and medical rehabilitation, areas like that, where we're also seeing just physical therapy, improvements, mental health improvements in ways that a normal traditional practice could not do. To actually improve outcomes for patients, pain management for patients. We see tremendous growth not only around trying to augment the things that we do today and that we're trying to do and work around from a pandemic standpoint, but it is accelerating areas like telemedicine, from home. And when you can't take, all of your patients and send them to the therapy, hospital, because it's very strict about who can and cannot go in. You need to start looking at more innovative ways to be able to bring those therapies into the home. And XR just becomes now an additional, a solution for those users. So I do find that we're really moving in a very fast rate. I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. If anything, it's going to remove the friction points of not being able to do some things because of more traditional barriers, like, when am I going to be able to fly there or go there? Because now you can be there from your home, as Michael, really noted, that you can bring this all into the home. And that will actually accelerate consumer adoption, because when mom and dad and when everybody else that's in the home is finding the value and finding the benefits and understanding the use cases for XR and how it can actually help them, they'll see it as a tool that then should be used in the home for a younger generation, and how it can help them, with memory, how it can help them with their education, how it can help them access different areas. I was lucky enough as a young kid to be able to travel to Europe, and experience a lot of amazing places. And now you're going to have, kids at a much larger scale being able to do that as a group and visit these locations and not, just for such a limited group.
So Dan, those are great points. I want to ask you about the flip side of that though, right? Because you talked about medical rehab and so on. We talked about a lot of the opportunities and potential here and even things that exist today. But what about issues like accessibility? What about, how usable is the technology really by everyone, right? So Liz, spoke about inclusiveness and accessibility. what are some of the challenges that we might face with the advancement of that technology and really adoption really by all?
Yeah, no, those are great points. And, when you look at it, I do think XR technology is following a very traditional, high tech, new innovation tech trajectory and adoption path. If you think about, I was making smartphones before they were called smartphones, and they were not accessible or affordable. And so as we look at that, as we look at the friction points of costs, accessibility to the technology, the content creators and the knowledge base there, and then the actual deployment and the tools to securely and safely deploy that to mass groups, there's friction points in all of those areas. The technology is very expensive initially. The prices are coming down. In consumer area markets, it's being highly subsidized by some brands in order to make it more affordable. That is a tactic and a path for doing that. And then in other areas, some companies are working with corporate environments because their ability to afford this and deploy it to employees is actually a more affordable path for the ecosystem to exist. And then you look at the number of developers that can actually monetize and make money through this process, and how that layer of businesses and companies can actually exist, and developers. That's really, really critical that there's a healthy ecosystem on the consumer side for developers and content creators to be able to make money and exist as an economy. And then it's really important at the business layer and corporate layer that they can go and work with, higher education institutions and the corporate and the design and innovation coming out of the institutions like Michigan and Stanford. And then also, how they will be able to work with corporate environments. So it is complicated. It is expensive. I do think over the next 3 to 5 years, all of that technology costs are going to come down. There's going to be more developers, and there's going to be healthier ecosystems for content consumption over the next several years. But we have to continue to infuse, both energy and investment into both the enterprise space and into the consumer space, and we have to make very healthy economies so that we can get the accessibility, and so that we can get the broad. That's critical.
I would agree completely. I mean, as a public institution, we're very focused on accessibility and ensuring all students have access to the technology. And, even as a public institution, there's a barrier to get in to the University of Michigan. And so not everyone has access. I think there are, we're thinking a lot about how do we make sure this, more people have access to it, and it's not the haves and have-nots, and, really exploring WebXR technologies so we can build on top of the web to deliver to more users. And a lot of the experiences we're creating, we're also creating a desktop version. So if somebody doesn't have a device, that they can still access it. We haven't talked a lot about augmented reality and mobile phones. A smartphone, iPhone 7 or Android 8 and newer have AR functionality built into them, so that can reach a lot wider audience. And there's still a number of folks that don't have that device either. Broadband connectivity, a lot of these need to be streaming high quality content, low latency, especially in VR. Like if it takes too long for it to load, it can really cause problems. It can make you sick, and that, which would turn you off from the technology and wanting to experience it again. So I think there are a number of challenges to be solved, and hopefully collaborating with industry and with government and education, we can begin to solve those.
And speaking of that collaboration,
Josh, and I want to emphasize that we've been focusing on the hardware or on the head-mounted device or any AR device. In this ecosystem for collaboration and interaction, we also need to address the application developers, the XR application developers, to really think about hybrid solutions, hybrid environments. So applications should run on different devices, depending on the availability, yes, accessibility and affordability, so that we can engage everyone in these learning activities or work activities. Mobility becomes another key aspect, and as everyone has been reminding us, it's the infrastructure, the broadband to the pillow, as we like to call it, everywhere for everyone.
So absolutely right. And then what we've talked about just over the course of this is so many different players in the space, right? Different things need to happen: application developers, device manufacturers, public, private. So is this something that the private sector can address on its own, or is this something that really requires public-private collaboration? And if so, what does that look like? Michael, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, and you mean in terms of accessibility?
And overall, I mean, really, it's these are all issues that tie back to typical technology adoption roadblocks, right? And so, when you tie it all together, how do we get past those roadblocks? Is it something the private sector can barrel through, or does it require that collaboration with the public sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. It's funny. I have a little bit of a different perspective, just because we've seen this now in the hands of hundreds of thousands of people across all the organizations that we work with. And I mean, obviously, we're dealing with a very specific use case in terms of workplace training, but we don't actually see the friction points, obviously, in the adoption, mostly because this is often a mandate by the organizations themselves for training. But I think in that way, just that little way, it's helping facilitate certainly the awareness and potentially directing organizations. I think Dan can speak to this as well. As we start to kind of focus on enterprise and organizations focus on enterprise adoption, there's a lot of things that are happening to develop even the technology. So there's, people are, becoming more aware, people are starting to adopt the technology. This is something that they start to see as, I can do it for workplace training, but I can certainly do it for other things. We talk about the price point coming down. I think the idea that is being subsidized by both the organizations and the hardware manufacturers themselves, along with industry, is definitely a thing. And I think that's only going to help to spur the adoption. And it is similar in some ways to smartphones, in the sense that, we're going to start to see the price point come down as adoption spreads, et cetera. I think there's a different challenge in some ways for certainly VR technology. I don't want to necessarily extend this to the AR technology, which really hasn't arrived yet, is this idea that you're putting something on your head. And not to sound kind of trite about it, but that is a barrier in some ways. With our phones, the ubiquity is also part of the design, right? Like in terms of our access to it, it's in our pockets, it's everywhere we go. That's not the case with headsets, even though they are mobile, which I think is a very underrated feature of a lot of the new devices coming out, that you can just pack it in a suitcase, for example. That does make it a lot more powerful, but it's not something that you would probably wear for more than 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour at a time in the day, where that's obviously very different with your cell phone. You're constantly accessing it for different things. So I do think it's finding those right use cases, and obviously workplace training is kind of a no-brainer in a lot of ways for all the reasons that we know it's useful. But there could be other applications, right? A shared experience, a collaborative experience for a workplace, or even outside of the workplace. So I don't necessarily think that the barriers are really in the hardware itself right now. I do think it's in finding kind of the right use case and understanding that, like, even the form factor right now isn't something that's conducive to ubiquity. So I'm curious to see if those are things that can even be overcome with policy and collaboration in industry. So. But like I said, the workplace training, having something that's very kind of much going on already in the world and using it for that to improve, I think there's obviously great power in that.
Yeah, and I was just going to add that you mentioned the nature of the devices as it relates to the ubiquity. There's also that question from an adoption standpoint with regard to kind of privacy, right, and user concern around privacy, which is something else to be thinking about too, since with this type of equipment, the nature of the information that's collected goes beyond what you might see, say, with your phone. So does anyone else have any thoughts on that in terms of what it might take in terms of public-private activity in order to increase that adoption?
Sure. I mean, I would say that you have to have a collaborative conversation between public policy, and what the private sector is actually innovating on and driving forward. As we are rapidly improving, the hardware, the technology, the platforms to distribute content, and then understanding, who's using that content. If privacy in a corporate environment requires the same privacy that they have today for their most protected intellectual property, and you have to make sure all that infrastructure is in place in the private sector, should be just following existing secure standards, ISO security, privacy security, to protect corporate environments and protect their content, whether they're training or whether they're designing the future of automotive design and transportation. Or if you're looking at from a privacy of just general consumers and how they're consuming the content, what is the content creators, what is the platform providers, what data are they capturing? And I think when I look at government and public sector, they're not really understanding that or seeing that. And as we do things like add eye tracking to the insides of an AR glass or a virtual reality headset, and how that information is then used, we can actually see what your eyes are looking at. We can actually see from a heat map what you're looking at in a spatial area. That may be these could very well be the golden new metrics and KPIs for marketers and salespeople alike, to just understand how consumer behavior better, and how to present products to them in a better way, in a more meaningful way, understanding consumption behaviors and consumer behaviors better. But that data all has to be protected. Those users and that information all has to be protected. We have to be good stewards of that data and that privacy, in the private sector, of making sure that we're protecting our customers and maintaining their trust. But looking at the government and looking at the public sector, they absolutely have to know what these platforms and these products are capable of seeing and using and capturing from a data perspective, and making sure that that's being held accountable and safe for everyone.
Yeah, to build on your point, Dan, in my mind, it's not just the government and industry that need to work together, but more of what we call a triple helix, government, industry, and academia partnership. And this is the right time to launch such joint efforts for the next 5 to 10 years, because change is hard, it's risky, and it takes time. And people need to be given that time to respond, adapt, and adopt. And regarding the privacy and security of data, I want to remind us all what was emphasized a couple of times by Suzan DelBene, and that is trust. And companies need to build consumer trust in terms of the privacy aspects. And in my mind, transparency is absolutely critical. Transparency and user control of their private data. So to build on behavioral economics principles, making all those elements of different types of data that can be currently collected, and in the future we'll see even more and diverse such data types, list them, make them transparent, and allow the user control, and have the default as an opt-out, and list the types of data that could be collected as an opt-in option for the consumer. And that is another way to start to build that trust of the user.
I couldn't agree more in terms of the amount of data that can already be collected. I think in a 20-minute VR session, you can collect about 2 million data points. on a person. And you can almost begin to accurately predict certain health conditions based on the way they move or where their eye's tracking or their location in space. I mean, we haven't even talked about hacking that and kind of moving somebody around in space, but that's an area as well to discuss. But I agree around the transparency about what data is being collected, giving you access to view it, who's accessed your data, who's it's been shared, who they've shared it with, the opting out, controlling that. I think more visibility into that. I mean, it's starting to happen in other social media spaces, but it's still pretty buried deep, and you have to really know your way around to understand how to find them. So making that simpler, I would advocate for.
I would also add that a lot of the privacy efforts now are still, I think the reason they haven't been as fruitful as they need to be is because there's just general lack of awareness in the public spectrum. So Renat, you have a good point, which is like, make it transparent what data you're collecting. But I don't think that's nearly enough to educate others to say, well, why is that important? Because we never do that, even with our phone data, right? Everybody's kind of up in arms about, oh, our Facebook data is maybe not as secure, but what does that actually mean? And what are the implications? And I don't think anybody's really started to articulate, and as all the panelists have mentioned, this is a much more kind of rich data set than we've ever had before by orders of magnitude. Right. It's not even close. And so what you can do on your phone, multiply the accuracy and all of that by a lot in terms of its predictive power and what other behaviors and insights you can get. And it could be a really powerful thing to help people, or it could be a really negative thing depending on who's using it and how they're using it. So I think, yeah, all those things are right and good, and obviously collaborative opportunities. But I think there's an education piece that's really missing for the public in general, and not just about VR data, but all of our data that we're sending off into the cloud constantly. And probably I wouldn't even say I know all of the things, you know, that are kind of being calculated and predicted on my behalf without my knowledge. And so this is something that I think is something that the government can easily take on, are those efforts. I'd like to see more investment there.
So that's all excellent points, and I think there's so much more we could talk about as well, but unfortunately we're out of time for the rest of this discussion. But this was really fantastic, and I think it's really incredibly interesting to think about all the potential that we have from this technology, the ways it can improve education in the workplace, not just today but in the future, but also so many things that I think the industry and public sector will need to get right about it too, as it continues to advance and develop in order to really achieve the potential in the right way. So I want to thank you all so much for joining today. This was absolutely fantastic. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Closing out our event today will be Representative Bryan Steil, who represents Wisconsin's 1st Congressional District and is the co-chair of the Future of Work Caucus. Gopal Ratnam is back to interview the congressman. Gopal, over to you.
Well, hello, Congressman Steil. Thanks so much for joining us for this panel discussion. So I wanted to start off by asking you, since you're a co-chair of the Virtual Reality Caucus, why virtual reality and what does it do for us? And can you tell us about what are some of the benefits and why we need it?
I think it has great opportunities to really improve the United States workforce. So before I ever ran for office, I worked in the manufacturing sector for well over 10 years in really trying to drive forward jobs and opportunities across different manufacturing platforms, and looking at what augmented reality can do, virtual reality is able to really, I think, accelerate and create efficiencies inside our manufacturing sector here in the state of Wisconsin. And then there's opportunities to go from manufacturing across the board into different industries in the United States. And one of the areas that I spent a lot of time on in Congress is our broader workforce development and making sure that we're preparing people for the jobs of the future. And as we look at augmented reality, virtual reality, there's some real opportunities to drive efficiencies, not only in the job sector, manufacturing, et cetera, but as well as our education sector.
Now, when you talk about driving efficiencies, you're talking about the effort and the time and the resources necessary to train people in part, and also education and so on, right?
Absolutely. There's businesses here in Southeast Wisconsin, the 1st Congressional District. You take Case New Holland, as they're designing and developing new farm equipment per se, they're able to leverage a lot of the virtual technology that is needed to be able to do that efficiently, and to be able to design that and work on that with people located in different areas. There's other companies like Astronautics that are doing heads-up displays for either civilian or military aircraft that are creating great opportunities, in particular on the training side, for pilots. And those types of technology, high technology, good paying jobs are available across the United States and including here in Southeast Wisconsin.
Now, in terms of the technologies that need to come together, the so-called enabling technologies, what are some of the big factors, or what are those enabling technologies that must be met or satisfied for virtual reality and augmented reality to take off and become more widespread?
I think maybe number one is we need to continue to address the skills gap that we have in the United States education system. And so in addition to previously working in the background in manufacturing, I also served on the University of Wisconsin Board of Regents, so the board that oversees the University of Wisconsin system, and spent a lot of time working in the tertiary education space. There's a real opportunity that we have to streamline and address both our four-year institutions, our two-year community schools, as well as our technical college system, to make sure that people have the appropriate and necessary skills to be able to take advantage of many of these new jobs that are coming online. And if we are working to prepare workers for the jobs of the future, and many of those are going to be in these high-tech spaces such as virtual reality or augmented reality, we have a wonderful opportunity to bring good-paying, high-tech jobs to communities across the United States, including right here in my home in Southeast Wisconsin.
Now, as a co-chair of this caucus, can you talk a little bit about what Congress needs to do to help both the underlying factors as well as help the demand for augmented reality and virtual reality to take off?
Maybe two things. One, I think it's important that members of Congress have an understanding of the sophistication and the development of these products. It's no longer simply video games, as people might have thought of virtual reality from years ago, that these are becoming technologies that are getting embedded in many critical sectors in our economy, from healthcare space to manufacturing to aviation, and just gaining a better understanding of that. I do think there's a great opportunity for Congress to get engaged on the educational standpoint. And what I mean by that is we're going to need to continue to shift to an education system that's addressing the workforce needs here in the United States, in particular as it relates to some of the core technical skills. I have legislation that I'm trying to move forward that addresses what would be competency-based education, where we give students recognition and credit for gaining core skill sets that are then marketable. Driving that forward, the University of Wisconsin system has a system that would allow that to take place. Some of our technical.
I think you're breaking up a little bit there.
To bring people into what is a quickly emerging and developing area of employment.
Now, you mentioned educating members on technologies. Now, in the past, we've had some really embarrassing instances of members of Congress trying to understand how Facebook works or how social media works. So where do you think members are at the moment in terms of understanding what are some, in fact, more advanced technologies such as virtual reality and augmented reality?
In my conversation with my colleagues, there's some that have a deep and firm understanding. I think it's helpful if you've been involved in some of these different businesses that have leveraged this technology as I have. But I think there's also room for growth. I think one of the challenges anytime that we see new technology being leveraged, in particular across what were core jobs in the United States, people often want to identify the risk rather than identifying the opportunity. And so you take an easy example of that. If you go back into the 80s when ATMs became ubiquitous, there were multiple articles in newspapers and magazines saying that that would be the end of people working in banking, that it'd be taken over by technology and robots. And if we look back with perspective of 20, 30 years, what we've actually seen is the opposite. So we've seen ATMs in technology in our financial services sector actually allow growth in employment and allow people to become upskilled in the work that they're doing in the financial services sector. So instead of being afraid of technology, we need to embrace it and determine how we can actually produce a better value add. And so as we look at manufacturing, I think some people or other areas that this technology can be used, it's easy to identify the risk that certain technologies could automate systems and remove the need to have human labor. Instead, we should be identifying that, making sure that we're working through a situation like that. But instead, we should spend a lot of our time looking at the opportunities that this also creates to allow workers to skill up, to be able to obtain higher paying jobs, and to identify how we prepare workers for the jobs of the future, in particular, those in these higher tech areas. And again, a company in my district, Aeronautics, that's doing heads-up displays for aviation, that's embedding some of these augmented reality systems. Those are high-paid engineering jobs right here in Southeast Wisconsin. So instead of just identifying the risk that technologies bring to the table, we also need to spend a lot of time looking at the opportunities and finding how can we leverage those opportunities here in the United States to create good, high-paying jobs here in our communities.
So on the question of risks and opportunities, it seems as if in the last few years, Congress always has come after the fact, after technologies have become widespread and have been embraced by a lot of people. Then you see the downsides and the pitfalls of the technology. Congress tries to come back after the fact and address those questions. So what do you think are some of the best ways to address the downsides of technologies like virtual reality and augmented reality, and how would you go about doing that?
I think some of this is conversations like we're having today are really helpful to key policymakers to understand what are those downsides, how do we address and make sure that we're taking care of those people that are negatively impacted, but then also spend a lot of our time looking at the job creation. So in the state of Wisconsin alone, we created 5,000 additional IT-based jobs in 2019 before the coronavirus impacted how some of these job accountings are there. And I think that we're going to continue to see that growth going forward. So we're seeing a lot of job creation here in the state of Wisconsin, as we are across the United States in the IT sector. And as we've entered this current era, being significantly impacted by the coronavirus and more people are working from home, I think what we've seen is a drive towards realizing the ways that we can leverage technology for individuals so they have the opportunity maybe to be able to work from home in jobs and in environments where that was previously not the case. And by driving forward that type of a discussion, I think we'll be able to get policymakers to embrace that technology, identify the risks, but also appropriately understand the benefit that these technologies can bring to the table in terms of employment in the pure IT sector, as well as in the sectors that are benefiting from this, whether or not that's healthcare, aviation, manufacturing, medicine, that we're able to leverage this technology to really upskill the employees, which is ultimately, if done correctly, will allow us to drive wages up for our employees as they produce more value add to the company that they work for.
Now, there's also risk in the world of virtual reality, especially in the context of training, like you mentioned, because training means that you capture the knowledge from, let's say, a worker who has spent 30 years in a field and has obtained a certain amount of knowledge and learning from being in that business. Now that knowledge needs to be transferred to a virtual reality environment, whether it's manufacturing, healthcare, or aeronautics, like you mentioned. Is there a danger that that learning that from an experienced worker that would have been provided on a one-on-one basis in the real world, when it's now transferred to virtual reality, does that mean people who have those skills and the knowledge to impart, they will lose their jobs and that they will be affected by the arrival of technologies like virtual reality?
But I do think there's probably always risks that are out there, but I think there's also great opportunity. And so I've seen this play out firsthand. Let me give you a couple examples. So I've seen firefighters using augmented reality as a way for their training and to learn how to prevent or to fight fires. And so you take a high risk job such as firefighting, where historically Many of these firefighters would go to an abandoned building that they could purchase and then burn that building and send men and women in to an actual fire to be able to train in a very high risk environment where some firefighters were ultimately hurt or significantly injured, possibly died in such a training scenario. By allowing us to use augmented reality, you can send that same man or woman into a building where the fire is projected onto their screen or their vision. They could still use the water, the hose, the training, the ladder, and be able to fight that fire, if you will, in a virtual setting, such that the safety of the individuals is significantly protected. We've seen in some of the training in law enforcement, which is a topic many of us are spending a lot of time looking at, is we look at ways that we can work to de-escalate situations, that we can use appropriate or only necessary levels of force. These types of trainings are invaluable to allow our men and women of the law enforcement community to be able to address very serious situations, but to do this in a training environment that's actually very safe for everyone. And so there may be risks that are identified, but they're often outweighed by some of the really positive benefits that these technologies can ultimately bring to the table.
One of the things, as you know, in the last few years has been a tech lash, that is a backlash against a series of technologies that until then people had been assuming were nothing but good things. And then we started to see all the downsides of it, especially social media. So now that there seems to be this mindset that, you know, people are very wary and cautious about embracing new technology. So in that context, the introduction of augmented reality, virtual reality, do you think that that's going to meet against a lot of skepticism about the benefits when people are wary of technologies at large? And how do you overcome that?
It seems like for all of time, as new technology comes on the market, human nature loves to identify the risk and the challenge associated with that new technology. And there are going to be challenges associated with this. There's going to be labor market shifts and adjustments. But the key, I think, is to stay focused and put forward policies that allow us to leverage this new technology in a positive way. And so one approach is to stick your head in the sand and hope and pray that these technologies have no negative or positive consequences. A better approach, I believe, is to study the technology, immerse yourself in an understanding of what that technology can do in a positive and negative way, and then put forward policies, in my case at the federal level, that allows us to leverage these technologies to the benefit of our society. And so going back to that early example I used about banks and ATMs, countless articles were written about how ATMs were going to make individuals working in banking completely irrelevant. Thousands of people would lose their jobs. And what we've actually seen is an increase in the number of people working in banks across our communities, as well as an increase in wages, because instead of having that young man or woman who is a teller slowly counting out money before you on Friday at payday, that lower value work is now done in an automated sense. And instead, that young man or woman that's at the teller is looking and helping you formulate your financial plan, to maybe offer you a car loan, to consolidate credit card debt, to prepare you to refinance your house. And so what we've seen is actually in the banking sector like that, wages going up. Often many of the starting wages at large financial institutions are now $15 to $18 an hour. And so in the manufacturing setting or in some of these other areas where this technology can be leveraged to allow our workers to produce a higher value product, I'm of the belief that if done correctly, we're going to allow these workers to produce a higher value of ultimate service. And as a result, higher wages will follow that as it has in other areas. And so I think there's always the risk that people want to put their head in the sand and pretend that these technologies aren't there. I'm of the belief that it's far better to embrace, to understand the technology, and then to put policies in place that allow the technology to be used for the broader good, and ultimately to allow workers to benefit from these technologies as they come to the table.
Now, one of the things that Congress has been discussing for several years, but hasn't quite gotten to it, is the idea of a federal privacy legislation ensuring that there's a countrywide standard for privacy and digital security. And do you think that that kind of a foundational legislation is necessary before we embark on widespread use of things like augmented reality and virtual reality?
I do think it's going to be very important that we have significant improvements in privacy technology, in the privacy of individuals as it relates to technology. It's an incredibly complicated area of law that overlaps in many different ways. And so what privacy and technology may mean as it relates to social media is very different than what it means maybe to your life insurance product. And so it's easy to think about maybe the right to be forgotten as it relates to Facebook. That's kind of an easy concept to understand. But what does the right to be forgotten mean as it relates to a life insurance policy or the beneficiary of that life insurance policy? How do you erase that beneficiary? Very complicated. And so that legislation, I think, will eventually come before us. And it's going to take the buy-in of multiple key stakeholders, both citizens who are concerned about their privacy, some of these large technology companies that collect significant amounts of data, and then an array of industries. And so I think it's important that we keep this at the forefront. Maintaining privacy, I think, is critical. The European Union, we saw come forward with legislation, some positive aspects of that, some very difficult aspects as it relates to implementation. We can use that as a real learning lesson to be able to formulate legislation that protects individuals and consumers' privacy, but doing it in a way that doesn't hinder our ability to leverage this technology in a positive way to the benefit of our society.
Right. I think we're right on time, and I have no further questions for you. Thanks very much for taking part in this event.
Thank you very much for having me on. Have a wonderful day.
Appreciate it. Well, thank you so much to everyone who participated in this event, particularly to members of Congress, Congressman Steil and Congresswoman DelBene, and also to the industry panel and everyone who took part on the panel discussion, and all of you who tuned in to the event. Follow CQ Roll Call for our coverage on technology and policy issues in Congress. Thank you very much.